From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
Congressional leaders express optimism following a meeting at the White House today that Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer described as intense, while Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell floats a minibus bill to avoid a government shutdown in just 4 days.
We'll have reaction to that meeting and a full conversation on antitrust, crypto, and even Fed Chair Jerome Powell with Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren.
And it's primary day in Michigan, with a question mark hanging over the president as the campaign to mark uncommitted on the Democratic ballot gains steam. We'll be speaking with Congresswoman Haley Stevens of Michigan, a Democrat caught in the middle of this right now, Kaylee, as voters get to it in Michigan. It's going to be interesting to read the results for Joe Biden.
It absolutely will, as there is this big push to vote uncommitted rather than for President Biden on the ballot there because of his stance in supporting Israel, despite what we're seeing happen to Palestinian civilians in Gaza. Yeah. So we'll know more overnight. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure how much more overnight we will know in terms of clarity as to how exactly a government shutdown by the end of this week is going to be avoided, a partial one at least. But certainly congressional leaders emerging from the White House, speaking with reporters earlier this afternoon, sounded pretty upbeat. Take a listen.
We are making good progress. We're hopeful we can get this done really quickly.
I'm cautiously optimistic that we can do what is necessary within the next day or so to close down these bills and avoid a government shutdown.
We're very optimistic. We believe that we can get to agreement on these issues and prevent a government shutdown.
That was after 90 minutes inside the Oval Office, and we're still wondering exactly what the plan might be. We spent some time shortly after with the senior senator from Massachusetts, Elizabeth Warren, who talked with us earlier today in our Washington studios about this and other issues. I started by asking her about a new effort by Mitch McConnell to float a minibus bill to avoid the shutdown beginning on Friday and whether she would support it.
Can I just be clear? This is the craziest kind of negotiation you would ever see. And that is that, as far as I can tell, everybody wants to deal, keep the government open. We've all agreed on what the numbers are. It's a budget deal, right? And everyone's agreed on it. And the Republicans in the House are just saying no. And it's hard to sit down and negotiate with somebody when you say, because you want what? And then some crazy thing flies in that the majority of Republicans don't even want, much less that you'll get Democrats on. So we're kind of in this shut down the government for what purpose? What are the Republicans trying to accomplish here? It's a kind of dysfunction that is not about Democrats and Republicans fighting each other. It's just Republicans who just can't seem to get their act together so that we do the most basic job of government, and that is fund it and keep it going.
Well, the goalposts, as we keep hearing, are moving on a couple of matters, including the supplemental emergency funding request for Ukraine, for Israel, for Taiwan. There's an effort in the House now to subvert the speaker. That involves Democrats and Republicans, a discharge petition that would bring defense only. It's a little different than the one you passed, and we'll see what they get on the border. Would you support an approach like that if it got the money to Ukraine?
Look, I think the key thing right now, and we were just talking about this among the Democrats just an hour ago, pass the bill that's already passed the Senate. We have Republicans, we have Democrats who voted for it. Ukraine needs the money now. The Ukrainians are running out of ammunition, literally. They need the help right now. This thing has already been vetted. It's gotten strong support from Republicans in the Senate. There are Republicans in the House who want to do it. There are Democrats in the House who want to do it. The path is there. All you have to do is just take it. Come on, Leader Johnson. Make it happen.
Well, of course, it's not just aid for Ukraine in question. It's aid for Israel as well. You have previously said the U.S. should be conditioning aid to Israel to protect civilian life in Palestine. And that is very much a topic of discussion in Michigan right now, where there is a primary underway and an effort for voters to back uncommitted rather than President Biden because of his policy in supporting Israel, despite what we're seeing happen in Gaza. Does the president deserve to lose those votes?
The president is doing he is working hard. And the president deserves our support. He has earned it, and he has earned it across the board. I want to be clear, though, when we're talking about what's happening right now in Israel, that the Netanyahu government, in response to terrorist attacks, the fact that there are still hostages that are held, the Netanyahu government has created a humanitarian disaster. And it's a disaster that gets worse every single day. In addition to that, the Netanyahu government has said no to a long-term peace solution that is a two-state solution, which is the official policy of the United States of America, and the one way that we can make certain that two states for two peoples who are able to live in dignity, in security, and with self-determination. We know what we need to do. Right now, we need to get those hostages back. We need a ceasefire in place. We need to open up that humanitarian relief big time. And we need to be pushing both parties toward a two-state solution where everyone in the region can live in dignity, security, and self-determination.
The economy is, of course, a big part of Joe Biden's pitch in Michigan and all over the country right now because the data are undeniable, the strength of this economy, despite the debate that seems to be being had around whether we're going to have a recession or not. But it's interesting. The more the Fed hikes interest rates, it seems the stronger this job market gets somehow. And I recall some pretty tough conversations you had with Jay Powell in Senate hearings where you called him a dangerous man because the idea was that this job market might not survive such intense rate hikes. Do you feel differently now?
Not only might not. Remember that the Fed put out a report a year ago, this past December, that said they were targeting watching the unemployment rate go up. They were going to keep raising interest rates until more people, millions of people, were unemployed. Now, it turned out they raised those interest rates and that didn't happen. And it's the reminder, the Fed has basically one tool on inflation, right? It raises interest rates. That works for some kinds of inflation problems. But this was a time when prices shot up in part because we were coming out of COVID. We had supply chain kinks, in part because the war in Ukraine had disrupted both food and energy supplies, and in part, and it's still happening, because in concentrated industries, we've watched big increases in profit margins as companies have engaged in price gouging. The Fed can't touch any of those. And in fact, I've asked Jerome Powell about this in hearings, and he's admitted, no, they can't do anything about it. Right now, those high interest rates are actually increasing costs for families because one of the big parts of cost for families is housing. Sure. And with interest rates high, we know it's more expensive to buy a home. We also know it's more expensive to finance an apartment building or finance any new housing construction. And all of that gets passed on to consumers. It's time to get those interest rates down.
So you would like to see the Fed start cutting rates as soon as the next meeting?
Yes.
Despite what may happen to the fight against inflation as a result?
Well, you know, they're off supposedly fighting inflation. They are not fighting some, not all, of the principal causes of inflation. And besides, let's keep in mind, 6 out of the last 7 months, inflation has been at 2% or lower. We've watched the numbers. They're in a pretty good place. And what matters, I think, is that we pay attention to how families are experiencing this economy. The Fed's job is not just a bunch of papers and numbers on a sheet of paper. It's about how families are living this economy. And keeping families so stressed on housing, not good for our country.
Of course, here at Bloomberg, we talk a lot about the Federal Reserve. We also talk a lot about deals, as we have seen a lot of news within the last week. The FTC yesterday filing suit to block the merger between Kroger and Albertsons. Of course, within the last week and change, we've had news of the Capital One Discover Financial merger, both of which I know you are against on anti-competitive grounds. But what these companies argue is that is how they're able to compete against a Visa or a MasterCard or an Amazon or a Walmart. Is it not anti-competitive to not allow consolidation to compete with the largest players that are out there?
So let me just start with, this is not the first time we've heard this argument. This argument has been used pretty much since the beginning of time in antitrust law. Oh, please, just let me get bigger so I can compete with the other giants. But let's unpack these just a little bit. So, for example, in the case of the Kroger-Albertsons merger, we've now, in earlier lawsuits that have been brought, and now information that's coming out through discovery, we see that those two giants have been communicating with each other about how to keep wages down for grocery workers at both stores. Potentially a violation of the law, but it tells us what they want.
This is the no poach agreement that they have?
These are the no poach agreements, right? Which is just a way to say, I'm paying these folks $7.50 an hour, $11.50 an hour, and I don't have to worry they're going to get hired away for $12 or $12.50, right? I don't have to worry about that. This is another way to say that this is how the giants see their way to improve profits. Do they improve profits by offering better service? Do they improve profits by lowering costs? No, that's not where they're going. They're looking at ways to reduce competition. And I got to say right now, particularly in the grocery business, where we've actually seen margins increase dramatically, both for the individual items you buy and at the stores, this is not a time for the FTC to say, sure, go ahead and merge. Let's just have one grocery store in each of these areas, setting prices and setting wages wherever they want to set them. Bad idea.
There's another issue you're very passionate about in addition to antitrust, and that is crypto. You have, in just the last week, gotten a new challenger for your Senate seat in Massachusetts, John Deaton, a pro-crypto attorney. There is tens of millions of dollars in crypto-backed PACs that could be weaponized against you in this election cycle, as the industry sees that you are pushing legislation in your anti-money laundering legislation that would essentially apply the Bank Secrecy Act, KYC restrictions to this industry, that is something that could completely wipe it out in the United States. Clearly, this relationship is antagonistic. Why not try to collaborate with the industry to fix the issues?
I want to collaborate with the industry. What I don't understand is why the industry seems to be saying that the only way that they can survive is if there's plenty of space for the drug traffickers and the human traffickers, and the terrorists and the ransomware scammers and the consumer scammers and the rogue nations, North Korea, that is financing about half of its nuclear missile program with crypto, that all of that has to be left open. You know, keep in mind, in our financial system, pretty much everybody follows the same set of rules. I'm talking banks and credit unions and credit card companies, gold traders and stockbrokers. Private equity now has to follow the rules. Precious metal dealers, Venmo, Western Union, but not crypto. My view of the world is same kind of activity, same kind of risk, should have the same regulation. I'm not looking for fancier regulation for them. I'm not looking for anything tougher for them. I just want a level playing field here where if you're part of the financial system moving around literally billions of dollars, that, remember, my bill is not a regulatory bill. It's a bill about law enforcement, that law enforcement has the same tools that it has anywhere else to be able to shut down the terrorists and the drug traffickers and the scammers. I think that's the right thing. And I welcome anybody who wants to come in and make that happen. And frankly, I don't understand a defense that says, no, we've got to make sure that there's a place for those guys to play without getting caught.
That was our conversation with Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts. Clearly quite wide-ranging. So let's break it all down now. Joining us is Bloomberg's Mario Parker and Peggy Collins, who is our Washington bureau chief. Mario, of course, leads our White House and politics coverage. We began that conversation with the senator basically on what happened at the White House earlier today, this meeting between the big four congressional leaders and the president, the vice president as well, and then followed by a one-on-one with Speaker Mike Johnson, where Johnson said he brought up the border in addition to Ukraine and the issue of keeping the government open. Was tangible progress made today, Mario, as congressional leaders say, we're optimistic, we're getting close? Unclear how close we are, but we do know we're close to potentially a partial shutdown if it's not tidied up in the next few days.
Well, I think that there's some, you could take some positivity from the fact that they all sang from the same hymnal book, right? It was they were all in the same key in terms of optimism. That's something that we haven't necessarily always seen coming out of these meetings over the past, call it a year or so. We've been at the brink with the ultra-conservative wing of the Republican Party, bringing us right there to the shutdown about, 3 times in the last 6 months. Yeah. So the fact that you've got some bipartisanship in saying that there's optimism, I think, is optimistic for us at least.
Well, singing from the same hymnal, true, with the exception of Mitch McConnell, because he wasn't there. Peggy, talk to me about the optics here. We know that he doesn't get along with or agree with Mike Johnson, specifically when it comes to funding for Ukraine. Have you ever seen a moment where the leadership split like this? He let Mike Johnson go out to the sticks alone, and he went back to Capitol Hill. Or was he trying to save Mike Johnson the embarrassment of having to disagree with him in public?
Well, I think, as Mario said, over the course of the past year, we've seen a lot of strife within the Republican Party. So I don't think this is the first time. But I do think that this divide on foreign policy and U.S. policy at the border in particular is one of the areas where the party is really coming apart in some ways, in the sense that today we saw that they're saying we're making good progress on keeping the government agencies open. But when it comes to funding Ukraine versus funding the border, making changes at the border, they're really at a breaking point.
Well, and it's very difficult for Speaker Johnson in particular to address not just trying to reach some compromise with the Democrats in the room, but trying to get consensus within his own conference. But he certainly said today, when addressing reporters after the meeting with the president, that he is trying literally around the clock. Take a listen.
We have been working in good faith around the clock every single day for months and weeks and over the last several days, quite literally around the clock, to get that job done. We're very optimistic. I hope that the other leaders came out here and told you the same. We believe that we can get to agreement on these issues and prevent a government shutdown, and that's our first responsibility.
Peggy, he says they've been working every day for months, barring that the House isn't even actually back yet from recess. They're not back until tomorrow. But it kind of speaks to the point that we have been trying 4 months to solve this funding battle. We've had 3 continuing resolutions. There's potentially going to need to be a 4th for at least some parts of the government to get this done. Can his speakership survive that when he had promised no more CRs? I just wonder how limited his options really are here.
Well, we have seen this movie before. I do think we also have to keep in mind that compared with last year, this year is an election year. So there's a couple of other pressures on the Republican Party this year because of that. One, that the American people are feeling that Washington is not doing enough and not functioning well. So do they add to that? And the other is really, how do they want the American people focused on dysfunction in the Republican Party, or do they want to be talking about the differences in policy and what they're doing on the border versus what the Democratic Party is, for example?
It was a stem winder of a tweet thread today from Chip Roy, of course, the Freedom Caucus. And he's been an agitator here. He doesn't like the business that the speaker has been having in the House, and he doesn't like the plan that came over from the Senate. On this matter, though, he says if we want to achieve something different, we have to do something different. Pick a fight and win it. Does Mike Johnson actually know what he wants to do at this point, or are we going to figure this out all together at the end of the week?
I think that's the fear that you have, the worry that you have from the White House in particular, right? Because what we saw, again, over the last month and a half or so was that Republicans got exactly what they wanted on the border from Joe Biden and then pulled the rug from up under him because Donald Trump, the presumptive nominee or the expected nominee for the Republican nomination, essentially issued a warning to his, or call to his party to abandon it, right? So there is the sense that no one knows who's exactly pulling the strings there with Mike Johnson. Is he going to be deferential to Trump? Will he be out of line with Trump? Will he be out of line with some of those ultra-conservatives that gave him the gavel in the first place? That's the question.
Well, and of course, as we think about the way that border security was tied to other matters, it was tied to the supplemental package that would provide aid not just for Ukraine, but Israel as well. And finally, Mario, just on the Israel note, it's worth noting that as we speak, at least for the next hour or two, polls are open in Michigan for the primary, where President Biden has some competition from uncommitted because of a push by Arab Americans, Muslim Americans in that state who have disagreements with the president over Israel and Gaza. How big of a signal should be drawn from Michigan as we look ahead to the general election on how much this issue could be problematic for this incumbent president?
Well, Kaylee, the White House and Democrats are trying to downplay it, right? They're trying to level set expectations. But anytime, Michigan is the crown jewel of the blue wall strategy of the Biden reelection bid, right? If there's a little bit of softness there or weakness there, that is a warning sign. Recall, Donald Trump won that state in 2016. It was fairly close in 2020. Mm-hmm. The fact that Biden has to kind of get this coalition back together with 8 months before the election is a troubling sign.
All right, Mario Parker and Peggy Collins, Bloomberg's very finest. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Now, coming up, we'll take a closer look at Ukraine aid, funding battles, everything related to Congress, and where that money actually would be sent if Ukraine aid were to pass. It could be a potential boon, in fact, for the U.S. defense industry. More next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. As the White House tries to secure emergency funding for Ukraine, President Biden says the money would actually spur investment here at home. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall has the numbers. Tyler.
Hey, Kaylee. The Department of Defense says that since Russia invaded Ukraine 2 years ago, at least $34 billion in security assistance has gone to U.S. defense companies. This is to build equipment to send to the front lines, replenish domestic stockpiles, and invest in the U.S. defense industrial base. Some of the biggest beneficiaries have been states home to the biggest production lines. This includes states like Texas, Arkansas, and Pennsylvania. It's a message the president's been trying to sell as he urges Congress to pass more funding.
I want to be clear about something, because I know it's important to the American people. While this bill sends military equipment to Ukraine, it spends the money right here in the United States of America, places like Arizona, where the Patriot missiles are built, in Alabama, where the Javelin missiles are built, in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Texas, where artillery shells are made.
Now, the Senate passed a bipartisan package this month. It would allocate nearly $60 billion in funding to help Ukraine. And we've been crunching the numbers here at Bloomberg and found that about 2/3 of that aid will likely stay right here in the U.S. This would be through security assistance that Ukraine uses to buy or transfer U.S. weapons, as well as money to replenish and invest in our own stockpiles. Republican defense hawks are on board with the plan, but it's facing pushback from some others in the party. I had the chance to catch up with Republican Senator J.D. Vance earlier today.
We're actually sending weapons to Ukraine so fast that it's eliminating our ability to plan for a contingency in East Asia, in the Middle East, or something else that would affect our own national security. So it's good to make more American weapons with American workers and in American factories. It's bad to send them overseas at a faster rate than you're actually building them.
Sales of U.S. military equipment to foreign countries hit a record high last year, totaling more than $238 billion. State Department data shows us that's a 16% increase from the previous year. Experts say security assistance, whether to Ukraine, Israel, or Taiwan, would mobilize what's considered much-needed investment in the defense industry here at home.
We are seeing our arsenal of democracy, our capability to build the weapons that we need to defend this country against all enemies, foreign and domestic, is drying up. We have been whistling past the graveyard of the military industrial base for so long, and perhaps Ukraine, as tragic as that may be, is the canary in the coal mine.
The House returns tomorrow after nearly 2 weeks on recess. So far, House Speaker Mike Johnson, who was at the White House today, has been reluctant to put Ukraine aid on the floor for a vote. Joe and Kaylee, we'll have to see if there's any movement when both chambers are back in session.
We sure will. Tyler Kendall, we thank you. It's really something. Kaylee, we've been talking about the defense industrial base, the DIB, as the Hawks call it around here in Washington, for months and months. Yeah. And you wonder if it calls for a rebranding of this legislation. Call it the Defense Industrial Base Act. And you wonder if that might get a different reaction.
Well, absolutely. Of course, it remains the case that many in the House specifically would rather prioritize the border than anything else, maybe including investing in manufacturing here at home. But it may be harder to refuse when you put it in these terms.
Yeah, it's something to remember when we see an eventual rebranding. Coming up, we're going to be joined by Democratic Representative Haley Stevens of Michigan on this primary day. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
The meeting on Ukraine was one of the most intense I have ever encountered.
It was an intense meeting, it was an honest meeting, and ultimately it was a productive meeting.
We said to the speaker, get it done. I told him this is one of the moments, I said, I've been around here a long time. It's maybe 4 or 5 times that history is looking over your shoulder.
When I showed up today, my purpose was to express what I believe is the obvious truth, and that is that we must take care of America's needs first.
This is an existential moment for the free world as it relates to being there for our Democratic allies.
The House is actively pursuing and investigating all the various options on that, and we will address that in a timely manner. But again, the first priority of the country is our border and making sure it's secure.
Congressional leaders, including the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, House Democratic Leader Hakeem Jeffries. Mitch McConnell did not come out to talk with reporters after their meeting with President Biden today on government funding and aid to Ukraine, Israel, and the border. Hard to tell if progress was made. And we're joined now by Michigan Democratic Congresswoman Haley Stevens, who will be back in the Capitol with the rest of her colleagues tomorrow to address these issues. Congresswoman, it's great to have you back on Bloomberg. I wonder your thoughts here. With 4 days to a government shutdown, are those the individuals who will prevent it from happening?
Look, I am very grateful everyone got together in the Oval Office. President Biden's leadership shining through, bringing people together. Some might remember he was the one who ended government shutdowns when he was Barack Obama's vice president. And I'll just say this. I really believe that we can tackle all of these challenges and we don't need them in one big bill. Yes, we need to stand by Democratic allies. Funding for Ukraine is really polarized, frankly, the House of Representatives. What we need to do on our border, it's mind-blowing that the Senate Republicans voted down a bill that they at one point largely agreed with and is meeting some of the concerns that the Biden administration has showcased around funding requests for the border. And it's just sad that we're constantly in these brinkmanship moments where we're going to potentially shut down the government during a time of extraordinary national security issues, as well as economic issues that are facing everyday Americans. Democracy is messy. We all know that. But I am standing by where I have been committed the entire time, delivering for the American people and delivering for the residents of Michigan.
Well, you mentioned trying to avoid a government shutdown. It's unclear if it's going to be minibus efforts or if it's going to be 4 separate bills that you have to vote on to avoid those partial shutdowns come midnight, really, on March 1st. Or if another continuing resolution may be needed. And there's also the question of whether or not conservative policy riders could be attached. It just seems very confusing what's going on here. But from your Democratic perspective, is there anything that you would not agree to keep the government open? Where are your red lines?
Well, look, we can't be held hostage by the most extreme members, the most conservative of conservative members of the Republican Party who oftentimes don't even agree with their own conference. And frankly, what they're talking about right now is shutting down the government. They're saying that that might be a good thing to have a partial government shutdown. And I wholeheartedly disagree. That, for me, is a red line. My money, not that I bet on my votes, but colloquially, my money is absolutely on just potentially buying more time with a continuing resolution. We've seen that now used several times over. I was really surprised that we left for this in-district work period. I was doing committee work. We didn't have a deal. Then a couple of days ago, we found out that talks have fallen apart. We rejiggered the schedule to come back midweek, all right, and we still don't know what we're coming back to. And look, people want clarity. The American people want transparency and consistency. They want a government that they can trust. I don't know how we do a partial government shutdown when we do have these national security issues hanging over us. And frankly, when we haven't reauthorized our farm bill and we've got agencies that are tied to our agricultural sector, tied to our manufacturing sector, I wholeheartedly endorse what you all were talking about in the previous segment with President Biden saying that funding for Ukraine invests in our manufacturing economy. I was just with a defense manufacturer here in my district, Navistar Defense in Madison Heights, just yesterday, and they showed me that. Proof is in the pudding that bill for Ukraine funding bolsters American jobs and puts our manufacturers at work, puts American innovation on play for the world to see. And so let's get that done. Let's move forward. There are other issues we need to tackle. If we're going to talk about domestic issues, I'm in a bipartisan paid leave working group. Let's get that done. Let's talk about full funding for special education in the United States of America, which has been a 50-year unfunded mandate that needs to get done, that's strangling the schools that I'm so proud to work with and represent here in Oakland County, Michigan. And let's continue to build off the success of the CHIPS and Science law that we passed last term in Congress, and do things like that for critical minerals, rare earth minerals, critical materials that are so important to our manufacturing base. We know we can't be overly reliant on adversarial nations, so let's build our supply chain. There's a lot to do, but we've just been stuck, as we have been this entire term, in Groundhog Day, reliving and repeating the same thing over and over again.
I'd say happy Groundhog Day, but it's primary day for you, Congresswoman, in the state of Michigan. And part of the storyline has been not so focused on the Republican contest, but some opposition that Joe Biden has been facing in blue Michigan by Arab and Muslim American voters over his policies in Israel and Gaza. It's even prompted this uncommitted movement that your Democratic colleague, Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, has been pushing. She voted today, and not for President Biden. She delivered a message, Congresswoman. Here's what she said.
I was proud today to walk in and pull a Democratic ballot and vote uncommitted. We must protect our democracy. We must make sure that our government is about us, about the people. When 74% of Democrats in Michigan support a ceasefire, yet President Biden is not hearing us. This is the way we can use our democracy to say, listen to Michigan.
Congresswoman Stevens, are you hearing this on the ground? And would a ceasefire announcement that the president says could come by Monday change that feeling?
Well, look, I'm going to just be honest with you. I'm here in a suburban district, Oakland County, Michigan. I've been working alongside Democrats since the end of last year, particularly heading into our off-year elections. And this is somewhat of a newfound movement. It's become popularized in the last couple of week or so. I proudly voted today for President Biden. I'm very committed to his agenda and what we're doing. And frankly, the Democrats who I've been working alongside, the canvases I've been kicking off, the phone banks, the rallies have actually been showing that support for him. Now, it's not to say that there aren't some people who are voting uncommitted. I have read that. I've gotten reports from colleagues. Obviously, you just played the video of a colleague of mine who's voted uncommitted. And we're going to have to see what unfolds tonight. There's not really polling. This came up again kind of late, this movement to vote uncommitted for pressuring the president around his Middle Eastern policy and approach. And it's a nuanced conversation as well in terms of where Biden has been leading and working on these issues. We're going to stand by democracy. We're not going to abandon a U.S.-Israel relationship. We are also going to feel and recognize the pain of our Muslim community and our Palestinian American community that has really been doubled over by the loss of life as a result of Hamas's unprovoked attack on Israel that was brutal and inhumane. So this nuance is playing out in real time. It's on people's phone screens. It's in our news. It's deeply painful. Yep. And what we have is a president who has been leading with grace, compassion, and understanding. And when he says that he thinks that we're going to see a pause in fighting so that we can release the hostages, that will be a resounding day. I'm the co-chair of the hostage task force in the Congress alongside French Hill from Arkansas. This is an unbelievable scenario. So that's where we're moving towards, folks.
All right, Congresswoman, thank you so much for coming back to Bloomberg. That is the Democratic representative from Michigan, Haley Stevens. Now coming up, we'll continue the conversation on the Michigan primary with our political panel. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Well, a couple things. Number one, you got to take a look at the other guy. He's about as old as I am, but he can't remember his wife's name. Yeah. And number one. Number two, it's about how old your ideas are. Look, I mean, this is a guy who wants to take us back. He wants to take us back in Roe v. Wade.
That was President Biden on Late Night with Seth Meyers yesterday, addressing Americans' concerns over his age. They discussed plenty of other things as well. Joining us now, our political panel, Lisa Camuso Miller, former RNC Communications Director, and Alvin Jordan of Rock Solutions. So, Alvin, obviously the president making these remarks and also speaking about a potential ceasefire between Israel and Hamas as soon as Monday while eating ice cream with Seth Meyers. All of it on the eve of this primary day in Michigan, where we may be about to find out just how great the resistance to President Biden's Israel policy really is. Are we overhyping uncommitted, or is this a real threat to him?
The resistance. I mean, I actually think that we were speaking about this a little bit earlier. I think that, on the one hand, I feel like Michigan is a state where, the president has really been focused. I mean, we've seen him on, kind of the picket lines with the auto workers. And I think in his mind, he would hope to have had Michigan kind of wrapped up. And this kind of presents a little bit more of an issue that really takes his focus where I think he would rather, be looking elsewhere. So in that way, I think that, it is a bit of an issue. But holistically, I think that, it really is, kind of more of a newfound thing that doesn't necessarily, I think, represent too much of the Democratic base. And so in that way, I think they'll downplay it and try to get past it. But it's definitely something to keep an eye on. I'd be curious to see, how the results actually turn out today.
I do find it fascinating that we're talking about this instead of the Republican contest, the contested primary in Michigan. But that's the way the conversation is right now. Lisa, what did you think of the optics there? The president talking about a potential ceasefire earlier while eating an ice cream cone wearing aviator sunglasses. Some folks compared that to George W. Bush with Watch This Drive while talking about the Middle East. Was that the right way to roll this out as someone who's worked in communications and optics for their career?
It's hard to really sort of parse and pull all of that together. I suspect that the White House is pleased that the president did as well as he did on Seth Meyers. It is a comedy show. And while I think he was making news about the fact that there may be a ceasefire, he was also trying to show that he is a guy who can have some sense of humor and can be affable and likable. So as much as I'd like to say that the optics of all of it together were a little bit unusual, I do think, too, that it showed. I mean, let's go back to the point that everybody says that they tend to vote for candidates that they prefer to have a beer with, right? So maybe that was what that was, is just to
Well, it may have
show
been intentional for that
connectional.
reason,
It very
which is
well
why I
could
asked.
have been. Yeah.
Beer, ice cream cone.
Sure, yeah.
Either sound pretty good right about now. But to
Take
Joe's
either.
point, Lisa, about the fact that there also is a contested primary in Michigan today, while we're all talking about Biden, it's Trump versus Haley. Trump clean swept the first four. Probably will also win this one. Is there any world in which Nikki Haley can surprise at this point? Or are we just done and dusted with her campaign?
Well, I mean, I think that we are going to see that Donald Trump will sweep the rest of the states. I think what Haley is trying to do, Governor Haley is trying to do, is that I think she's trying to just offer an alternative and to stay part of the conversation. And she has said that after Super Tuesday, there will be a reevaluation. To me, it's interesting, though, that supporters are staying with her. People are still speaking up for her. Money is still flowing in. And that, I think, speaks to the fact that Republican voters are still looking for another alternative. And so that, I think, is probably the one thing that I'll continue to watch to see how it is she goes on after Super Tuesday.
Outside of the Republican Party, you mean? Because, a lot of folks are looking at no labels right now. Alvin, you might be one of them. And they're looking at her, as what we understand from the organization. Would that be a worst nightmare scenario for Joe Biden? If you talk about spoiler, that would be it, wouldn't it?
I mean, that would be it. And I think it's funny because maybe more tongue-in-cheek at the time, kind of joked about this, I feel like a few months back, as far as where things might fall with Nikki Haley. And I think that we're kind of seeing that now, whereas, like, unfortunately, and maybe fortunately for some others, the former President Trump kind of getting the nomination would, I think, be the best-case scenario for the Biden administration. That's for sure.
Well, we're going to have a lot more with our panel coming up, and hopes to avert a partial government shutdown. The president did gather with congressional leaders today at the White House. Will anything come of it? We'll talk to the panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I don't think that we'll have a government shutdown, but the fundamental mistake that I think Biden has made is that he doesn't recognize how serious House Republicans are about border security. The president takes some concrete steps there. The risk of a government shutdown is high, and they may very well shut down the government until Biden does something meaningful on border security. I think they still underweight that as a possibility.
Republican Senator J.D. Vance of Ohio earlier talking with us at Bloomberg, joining us now. Again, our political panel with Lisa Camuso-Miller, former RNC Communications Director, alongside Alvin Jordan of Rock Solutions. I guess he's saying that out loud, Lisa. We might shut down the government until Joe Biden gets this border thing done. After what we heard in the driveway of the White House today, do we have any reason to believe that won't happen?
No, it sure looks like we're headed that way. And why are there so many emergencies that are happening? And that's not the one that everybody's the most worried about. I mean, we're going to shut down the government on Friday. And that's a concern. So to me, I think that it's time for the one thing I just keep coming back to is that House Republicans are governing like they want to be in the minority. If we shut down on Friday, the blame does not go to the White House and it does not go to the Democrats. It goes to the Republicans. And that is going to be a calculated mistake.
Well, Alvin, as Mike Johnson emerged from the White House, he said, I had a one-on-one with Biden. It was the border that I brought up. Biden himself is going to the border on Thursday. So is, to that point, former President Donald Trump. That's They're not going to the same place, but they will both be there doing the split screen thing. And our understanding at this time is not going to get any new executive action. It seems like he's just making a trip. Is that not a missed opportunity to say, OK, Congress, you want it? Here's some EOs, and now keep the government open come Friday?
Missed opportunity, maybe, but I think, as we've continued to, I think maybe now for the sixth time, talk about the government potentially shutting down, it seems that, the blink of an eye, and maybe it's to your point about the Republicans kind of, acting in a position that, maybe is not what we believe, that they are kind of, working toward getting it done. It's a weird hostage situation up until the 19th hour, and then there are, a few concessions, and then here we are, and then things are still open. I don't think that anyone involved, either individual or party aside, can, with everything that we're talking about, obviously in an election year, can afford for the government to shut down. And so on the merits of that alone, really, I feel like, we'll figure out, or they'll figure out a way to get things done.
Kayleigh reminds us the president's going to the border on Thursday. So is Donald Trump. Why go there if you don't have something to announce? Will there be a deliverable? And as we look at the State of the Union as a potential new deadline for a lot of these issues?
Well, I mean, I'm from Texas. It'll be hot. Maybe it's for the ice cream. Who knows? But I will say, at this point, it really feels like, at least from the president's perspective, that the administration at this point is just trying to check the boxes. It seems like, there's an issue in Michigan, we'll get back there.
Yeah, right.
There's an issue at the border, we'll show a little presence.
Mm-hmm.
We're, not doing so well with younger voters, we'll be on Seth Meyers. And so I think they're really kind of full steam ahead, which, again, to my point earlier, I would imagine that the president and his team would rather be kind of focused and hunkered down on some other things. Right. But I think they're really playing from the defensive posture now and having to kind of make some of these impromptu appearances, if you will. And so hopefully from an optics perspective, that will at least allow some of the talking points to make a bit more sense.
Is Mike Johnson not also operating from a defensive posture right now rather than offensive? I'm not sure that I have a real understanding of what it is the speaker wants here.
Well, I think he's trying to keep his conference in place, all working together. And so that is a really difficult job. It's an untenable job. He has so few. Yes, we're in the majority, but only by 2 or 3 seats at my last count. I've lost count at this point. But it's so few that it's difficult for him to keep them together. So I think he is trying to satisfy the conference while also getting the government to function as the way it's supposed to. And that's a really difficult job. I don't necessarily think that he's doing anything. He's not making anybody happy, unfortunately. And that, I think, is the biggest problem that he has right now.
We talked earlier about this missive from Chip Roy on Twitter. It's a long thread. It ends with, pick a fight and win it. That's what his conference wants to see him do. Did they get that today?
Well, I think it's very difficult. That's the first time he's been in a meeting of the Big Four at the White House, right? So this is, I think, a lot of learning on the job. It's really hard. I think that that's the biggest obstacle that he has, is not only has he been chosen to lead, but he has to pick that fight, to the congressman's point, and to make it happen. And that's a big challenge. So I'm not sure he made that happen today. Looks like the Republican Senate and the Democratic Senate is in a different place than the House has been. And for as long as I can tell, that's the way things are going to go for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, Mitch McConnell was not standing shoulder to shoulder with Mike Johnson out there on the portico like Schumer and Jeffries was indeed. Lisa Camusa-Miller and Alvin Jordan, thank you both so much for joining us. And, of course, for more coverage, check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
We thank you for joining us on Balance of Power, and we'll meet you back here tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.